The elderly, disabled, and children are the ones making tough sacrifices. Labour has always referred to these as hard choices, but the reality is that there has never been a more spineless government in recent memory, targeting those who have the least power and influence. It's an easy target for a cowardly administration. Recent revelations show that Keir Starmer's Labour government is overseeing a funding crisis in schools that threatens to derail the education of an entire generation. A staggering £700 million shortfall in school budgets for the 2025 to 2026 academic year means that 76% of primary schools and 94% of secondary schools in Britain will struggle to meet their expenses. This unacceptable funding gap is a direct result of the government's failure to prioritise the education of our youth, even as billions are funneled into defence and military assistance for Ukraine. Once again, the implications of Starmer's government spending decisions are apparent. These cuts will leave the next generation ill-prepared to build a future for Britain. This inaction is unforgivable, as are the justifications provided by the government that have been ignored despite numerous warnings. With 4 more years of this ineffective government to endure, the scale of the funding crisis is alarming. Schools throughout the UK are facing a collective deficit of £700 million in the upcoming academic year, forcing the majority of primary and secondary institutions to implement cuts that will severely impact the quality of education. Class sizes are likely to increase, extracurricular activities could be eliminated, and essential resources like textbooks and technology will be scarce. Teachers, already overworked and underpaid, will find themselves under even more pressure to maintain high educational standards with dwindling resources. The recruitment crisis in the teaching profession, which has been dire for years, is unlikely to improve. This crisis goes beyond just funding. It reflects a lack of vision. Education is the cornerstone of a thriving and equitable society. Yet the government has opted to invest in other areas, such as defense and financial aid to Ukraine, rather than in the needs of our children. In other words, our children are paying the price so that the wealthy do not have to contribute more. The government could easily source additional funds from the wealthier individuals, but has instead chosen to cut school budgets while boosting spending in certain areas by billions. It is a clear indication of misplaced priorities, keeping the rich excessively wealthy while providing generous donations to political parties and politicians or investing in military endeavours instead of the future of our children. This negligence is a blatant dereliction of duty. You may recall the introduction of VAT on private school fees, which was supposedly intended to generate funds for state schools. Initially, this policy was expected to raise money, but it has been undermined by the rampant inflation arising from the economic mismanagement of Chancellor Rachel Reeves. Critics of this plan had predicted that the VAT increase would lead to an exodus of students from private schools, resulting in a decline in income and consequently no additional revenue generated. However, the expected drop in enrollment has not occurred, with the numbers remaining steady despite the VAT increase. The School Cuts Coalition, a collective of teaching unions and educational organisations, has openly criticised the government's management of school funding. In a parliamentary briefing, the coalition warned that the current funding level is unsustainable and that schools are nearing their breaking point. They've called for urgent action to address the funding gap, which includes increased investment in education and a reassessment of the government's spending priorities. The Institute for Fiscal Studies, IFS, has also chimed in, issuing stark warnings regarding the state of school budgets. They indicate that rising costs, particularly in energy and staff salaries, are outpacing funding increases. As a result, even schools receiving additional funding may find their budgets stretched thin. The IFS warns that, without significant investment, the quality of education in the UK will continue to deteriorate, creating long-term consequences for both the economy and society. What has the Department of Education had to say about this situation? You'd think they would have plenty to say. Surprisingly, they've accused schools of mismanaging their budgets. An excerpt from Schools Week reveals that the Department for Education stated it trusts schools to handle their own finances, with most operating with a cumulative surplus, while only a minority have deficits. Schools are expected to fund the increases in teacher pay from both new investments provided in the budget and their existing resources. This expectation places additional pressure on schools to prioritise their budgets for these new pay costs, all while being told to ensure maximum value for overall resources. The department acknowledges the challenges faced by schools, but attributes the £22 billion deficit inherited by the government to the need for difficult decisions across the public sector to regain financial control. This convenient narrative blames schools for their budget management while expecting them to cover the increased pay for teachers, which they must offer to retain staff. This dismissive attitude not only insults school leaders and educators, who understand the reality of their financial situations and strive to deliver quality education with minimal resources, but also reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of the challenges they face. Schools are being asked to do more with less repeatedly, compounded by 14 years of Tory rule, and no amount of financial manoeuvring can make up for a £700 million shortfall. The government's refusal to acknowledge the severity of this crisis is inexcusable. Instead of taking responsibility, they shift the blame onto the schools themselves, further undermining the confidence of parents in the education system. This short-sighted approach is perilous, risking alienation of those dedicated to ensuring that children receive quality education, many of whom are leaving the profession due to frustration. Moreover, the government's failure to invest in education is part of a broader pattern of neglect toward children and families. The Department for Work and Pensions, DWP, has already come under fire for stripping benefits from some of the most severely disabled individuals, which has resulted in the loss of disability benefits for 170,000 children, as part of its transition to universal credit from the older benefits system. Under Starmer's Labour, cuts have begun with our children. Recent DWP data indicates that 22% of individuals lost their benefits due to universal credit's managed migration, affecting over 330,000 people across 222,000 households, the majority of which have children. It is troubling to note that the majority of those losing out are women. Starmer's Labour government has failed to protect our children from the ramifications of its own cuts. The £700 million shortfall in education funding represents another betrayal of our youth and a failure to invest in our country's future. The flawed policies of this government, such as the ill-fated VAT on private schools, have become nothing but smoke and mirrors, while their dismissive responses to the School Cuts Coalition and IFS warnings reveal a lack of leadership and foresight. The government continues to let down this country repeatedly, and it is hard to believe they have only been in power for 8 months, as it feels like years of failures. Beyond just neglecting children and the disabled, this Labour administration is also neglecting those dependent on benefits, often affecting both groups. It's alarming to realise that the same wealthy individuals they refuse to impose any new taxes on are influencing the decisions of this Labour government. It seems Rachel Reeves has been swayed by these affluent interests to abandon the common people, and now we see the reality of the budget cuts that Labour is preparing to enforce, to appease the elites they bow to and accept donations from.